Open your mind.
Halaka Media, the signature of quality and expression. Pioneering production. Trilling Dolby ProLogic surround sound. Innovative, captivating. Compelling audio range. Open your mind. Open your mind. There lies an organization which acts above the law, an organization that acts without conscience, without morals, without regrets. A group who follow only a dark and untouchable ideology. Black helicopters and black ops are real. An organization above the law without a god and without a conscience do exist. There is no price too high and no casualties too great. A cold, rogue organization that has risen up independent of the people, independent of government.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
It was not until 1941, when motivated by Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, that the USA decided that it was time they became part of what was known as the Great Game. When the US entered World War II, they were lacking in vital spy and counter-spy skills. The Russians, British and Germans had been mastering these skills for centuries. The USA was at an obvious disadvantage. The wheels were set in motion, and in 1942 the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was created. General William Donovan, a World War I hero, was selected to head the organization. His determined, jovial personality and his upper-class status set the tone and played a significant role in shaping the actions and attitudes, actions that would later be inherited by the OSS successor. The OSS not only carried out the daily operations of intelligence gathering, but in addition, it was engaged as a concealed weapon for the various resistance and partisan organizations fighting in occupied countries in both Europe and the Far East. The hierarchy of the organization was students of Harvard, Yale, and other Ivy League colleges, sons of the upper class, who could combine exquisite taste, impeccable manners, and brutal ruthlessness. The OSS had developed several assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler. They almost succeeded in their attempts when a bomb plot in 1944 came close to blowing him up at his Wolf's Lair. As Germany collapsed, a race against the Russians for Nazi technology and intelligence begun. The OSS, under the codename Operation Paperclip, obtained a number of files and records detailing experiments involving mind control and psychoactive drugs that were conducted on the concentration camp inmates. They also obtained key surviving Nazi personnel such as Joseph Mengele, the doctor in charge of human experiments. Mengele and other war criminals were quietly relocated to Canada. General Reinhard Gehlen was the head of Hitler's intelligence. When Germany's defeat was imminent, Gehlen predicted that the future conflict would be waged between the two emerging superpowers, America and the Soviet Union. Gehlen, as part of a deal with the American military, agreed to surrender important documents pertaining to the Soviet Union. In addition, as part of that deal, he asked that his organization, the Gehlen Organization, be absorbed into US military intelligence. In 1947, the US Congress passed an act that absorbed the OSS into a new organization called the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was born. The newly found agency had the responsibility of coordinating, evaluating, and disseminating information from other US intelligence organizations. However, written in the fine print of this act was the additional duty of fighting the dark and imminent Cold War against communism. In 1953, the CIA began its full-out war against communism. The Red Threat was equated to Satanism. This threat was declared the enemy of the free world. Such a danger was to be unrelentlessly fought tooth and nail. Every tool in their arsenal was to be used to crush any communist rhetoric. In a direct attempt to limit the powers of the CIA, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover restricted all CIA operations to those dealing with overseas matters. However, by 1953, under Director Allen Dulles, the agency had become a law unto its own. All of its actions were protected on the grounds of national security.
The most privileged information about the world has been coming to us, to our policymakers, since 1948 through the CIA. Then the worldview that the CIA has presented in the Oval Office is a worldview that basically is founded in a Nazi intelligence organization, the Gehlen Organization, which has been there from the beginning, and what we have today is simply the heirs of that original choice.
The policy adapted by the agency was that once you were against communism, nothing else mattered. They therefore had no scruples about hiring the most powerful organized crime families to do their dirty work. The question was asked, how long could a supposedly democratically sanctioned organization go on doing business with thugs, madmen, and gangsters without starting to resemble them? The first victim in the CIA's path of destruction was to be Guatemala. In 1952, Guatemalan President Jacob Arbenz signed a land reform law that would ultimately take into state ownership the large number of plantations owned by US fruit companies. Allen Dulles felt that Arbenz might be an inspiration to other countries in Central America. This would undoubtedly lead to a destabilization of US economic interests in these countries. Arbenz had to go. Using leaflets, planted articles, comic books, and news stories, the agency spread the alarmist impression that Guatemala was going to become communist at any moment. Rumors were spread of Arbenz's supposed plan to replace the regular army with armed militia and make himself the absolute dictator of the country. The radio station La Voz de Liberación, controlled by the CIA, began broadcasting out of Honduras the false impression that thousands of anti-communist freedom fighters were massing on the border ready to invade. Arbenz, however, never had more than 400 men under his control at any point in time during the revolution. He was now losing the support of his army and air force. On June 2, 1954, a failed attempt was made on Arbenz's life. 2 weeks later, CIA plans went into action, bombing and strafing the major cities, including the capital, Guatemala City. It was at this point that Arbenz, who had previously stood strong, could no longer stand the pressure, and after persuasion from trusted senior officers, Arbenz handed in his resignation. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, leader of the anti-Arbenz Liberation Army, moved in, and with the support of the agency, took political control. Armas subsequently reversed most of Arbenz's reforms and offered great concessions to foreign investors.
It is clear that this nation, in concert with all the free nations of this hemisphere, must take an ever closer and more realistic look at the menace of external communist intervention and domination.
Next on the CIA's list was Cuba. The attempt to destabilize this country would prove to be the CIA's worst nightmare. Cuba, under the leadership of